Hey YouTube, Sinister here with a sequel to my Dark Souls video. Today I want to discuss a huge issue that I have with people's opinions and blatant criticizing of Dark Souls 2. And as with my first video, I refused to talk about a subject that I didn't have extensive knowledge in, so I went through and beat the second game to make this video. And the topic of discussion is why Dark Souls 2 is good and why Dark Souls 1 fans hate it. The format of this analysis will be different than that of the last video. There will be less comedy involved in this one, and I'll be talking about issues that legitimately bother me and my reasons why. So I repeat from the last video, if you don't like to hear other people's opinions, get off this video, because this is entirely about my own opinions and how they've changed over the course of my Dark Souls 2 playthrough. The first portion of this involves my experience through this game. So, like most anyone out there who played the first game front to back, side to side, up and down, in and out, I hated Dark Souls 2. It was so different and none of the changes made sense at first. I remember telling my girlfriend, now fiance, that Dark Souls 2 sucks and that I only owned it because I was too lazy to trade it in. Then somebody came into my life who I'll never forget, not for all good reasons either. My fiance's best friend and her boyfriend moved into our place and he was crazy about the second game. He started playing my PS3 religiously, like literally from the time he woke up until the time he went to bed. And watching him play, I realized that Dark Souls 2 was actually a lot of fun. Just like the first game, there are moments that seem grueling and utterly unfair. And also, just like the first game, there's a certain tactic required to tackle each and every obstacle. Unlike the first game, however, you can't just tank the mob's attacks with heavy shields. You have to dodge sometimes, you have to occasionally throw out a sorcery, hex, or miracle. You have to learn to play riskier. And then I realized, I don't hate this game because it sucks. I hate this game because it takes me out of my comfort zone. So I made changes. I dropped the heavy armor for some that allowed me to mid-roll. I kept the greatsword, but I focused on beefing up my stamina so that I could wield it efficiently and still remain below 70% equipment load. I learned enemy patterns more intimately. I learned when to roll back, when to roll to the side, when to block, and most importantly, when to run. The biggest difference between the two games, in my opinion, is the mobs. There are a lot more humanoid enemies and monsters in the second game, whereas there were a lot of slow or weird or fantastical creatures in the first. To account for that, one has to be in the mindset that they're fighting people, not mindless monsters. And so that is what I did, to my very dismay. Because halfway through the game throws spiders, basilisks, and dragons at you. And then you have to learn a new way to play. One that focuses more on launching barrages of spells at your enemies. And I hope it is apparent by my last video, but magic is not my forte in games. I suck with magic. Or at least, I did. Then I found hexes, and oh my lord, I love hexes! I can contribute this new type of magic for getting me through the later half of the game. If I had known about hexes at the start of my Dark Souls 2 playthrough, I would have straight up focused on a hex build. For one, there aren't many enemies resistant to dark. Not only that, but for every sorcery and miracle, there is almost always a hex counterpart. Life sapping, orbs of darkness, a vortex of swirling darkness, hexes that buff you, hexes that debuff enemies, hexes that inflict status conditions. There is everything. My favorite is Dead Again, a hex that ignites a dead body and then causes it to explode, dealing area of effect damage to anything in a 10-foot radius. While not practical in many situations, it sure is a lot of fun. Particularly when starting a New Game Plus and then going back through the woods where you can amass countless dead bodies. Wow. That just got really morbid and weird. Moving on. Dark Souls 2 changed my mind fairly easily. I'd only played it for maybe 10 hours before I went back to it. So why do people still hate on it? Well, I feel like the people that hate it just aren't willing to give it a chance. The fluid and responsive controls are too good. The enemies are too human and generic. I have a cat sitting on my lap and purring. Anyway, my guess is that anyone who hates Dark Souls 2 is either somebody who hates Dark Souls games in general, or somebody who played it for 10 seconds and thought, this isn't Dark Souls, that's too different. In reality, it isn't that different. More spells, more armor sets, more weapons, more basic enemy variants, and more bosses. But it's still a Souls game. I personally love that they altered the controls to make it more fluid. I would have liked to see more variety in enemy types and less humanoid mobs, but that's a very minor complaint. The world is a lot less open, and there are a lot tighter spaces that the devs expect you to fight in, which makes for uncomfortable situations, but you get used to it. It becomes fun when you let your guard down and try to play different styles. Since we're on that topic, let's talk about bosses. A huge complaint by Dark Souls 1 fanbase is that Dark Souls 2 bosses are too similar, too human. To which I ask, how? How are any two bosses even remotely similar in Dark Souls 2? Design, sure, but gameplay is what we're talking about. Go ahead and try to fight the Ruin Sentinels the same way you fought the Dragon Rider. Have fun trying to spam spells at the Looking Glass Knight. And the final boss, Nashandra. Oh my god, Nashandra. Did anyone die against Gwyn in the first game? Tell me honestly, how much of a final boss was Gwyn? He was pathetic, but Nashandra wrecked me. And wrecked me some more. Until I had abandoned hope and resorted to just rushing in, swinging my sword, she wrecked me. That, my good people, is a fucking final boss, and I loved it! I mean, the key point of any true Souls-style game is that the challenge to overcome is a massive burden to carry. But all the while, it keeps you lusting for more. And I'm sorry, if Dark Souls did that, then Dark Souls 2 did that twofold. Perhaps too much at times. Dark Souls 2 is hard. There's no way around that. It is excruciatingly unfair at times. It gives you no cues about what tactic to use against what bosses, and that leads to far more deaths than the first game. Another key feature people seem to hate about this game is the semi-permanent health loss when you become hollow, and the more you die, the more health you lose. In the early stages of the game, that is hell to deal with. When you have a finite amount of effigies at your disposal, this is remedied about 25% through the game though, when specific enemies drop effigies. Speaking of specific enemies, one huge issue I have is that each bonfire section has a spawn limit of around 15, meaning when you kill an enemy 15 times, they're gone for good. Until you increase that bonfire's intensity and successively fuck yourself over for the chance of getting more soul grinding, using a bonfire aesthetic increases that area's difficulty to New Game Plus. Using another increases it to +2, and so on until you can no longer handle the difficulty, and trust me, that doesn't take long, but I like this feature. I stated before that this is much more difficult than your first journey into the vast world of Dark Souls. I do not understate when I say that it is at least twice as difficult. The enemy AI is more intelligent, the bosses are bigger and badder than before, those elusive unique items have lower drop rates, and the mechanics are built around fucking you up and keeping you fucked up. I can't remember a single time in my playthrough of the first game that I was stuck for even 3 or 4 deaths, but I can account for multiple segments in the second where it took me over 5 deaths or more to finally overcome an obstacle. The game just bests you in ways that the first game couldn't, and people can gripe and say, well, it's just unfair. I say, nay! It is not unfair. It simply asks more of you, as a good sequel should. It begs you to experiment with the various builds, to utilize mechanics that you would all but gloss over in the first game. That, my friends, is excellent game design. To force you to break free from your normality and venture into other ways of slaughtering your foes. As I mentioned, in Dark Souls 1 you can basically hide behind a shield for the vast majority of the game. You can't do that here, because enemies can knock you out of your defensive stance way easier, or they can spam you with magic that ignores your physical defense. But tanking is still a viable option for a lot of this game, just not nearly as much as before. And so the player must be more tactical, more calculative to survive. It isn't enough to stick with one playstyle, I can't emphasize this enough. You have to experiment with different options, and I can promise every one of you that when you do, you'll gain so much more than you ever did beating the first game. When you can take on one set of enemies like a tank, bashing and bloodying them with your greatsword, then whip out your handy staff and remove your shield to dance around launching spells at the next wave, only to equip your longbow and snipe the next before they even see, hear, or smell you coming, you will feel like the true hero that this game is trying to mold you into. Through good and lackluster boss fights, grueling sections with questionable enemy placements, from the Forest of the Giants to the Arches of Drangleic Castle, this game was like no other. It is unrivaled in the challenge it provided, the skill it demanded, and the rage it induced. I used wikis and game guides as little as possible, literally only when I had no foreseeable path to take. All in all, I have found that I thoroughly enjoyed a lot of the new features, such as the hexes. Mainly I stuck with my same approach, throwing up that great shield and awaiting my chance to take massive chunks out of an enemy's health bar with my fire greatsword +10. And when I did have to resort to more creative means of disposing all who stood in my way, I had a great deal of fun with it. Right now, in my early stages of my New Game Plus, I'm rocking Havel's armor set with a few alterations here and there for convenience, my fire-infused greatsword and occasionally the moonlight greatsword, and the lovely and severely overpowered sunset staff. And I absolutely love it. That's really all I can say is I love it. I love this game. It did everything that the first game did, but it did it so much better. Now from that segue, let's recap on some good designs and mechanics in Dark Souls 2 as compared to the first game. The controls are smooth and responsive. There's a wide variety of spells ranging from sorceries to pyromancies, miracles, and hexes. There's a vast expanse of weapons and armor for all classes, and almost every boss has an armor set to match. The bosses are difficult, but not necessarily unfair. There's a sense of justice in the game in the form of if you kill an NPC, you're going to make the game far more difficult than necessary. It instills this feeling of, oh my dear God, what have I done in the player? The world is vast, colorful, and downright gorgeous. Every character has a very unique personality. The story is fantastic when you actually take the time to delve into the archives that are item descriptions. The game forces you into making hasty decisions and tackling playstyles you may not be familiar with, but grow to enjoy. In the end, I firmly believe that From Software knew exactly what they were doing. They took an already amazing game and built it up to so much more. Dark Souls 2 is, in my avid opinion, even better than the first. Okay, so once again, the main portion of the video is out of the way, so let's open this up for discussion. What are your opinions on Dark Souls 2 and why? Do you think that the first game was better, that the sequel just falls short somehow? Or do you share my opinion that From has crafted a masterpiece from a beautiful work of art? I am honestly interested in your guys' opinions on this subject, so leave those comments. I'm Sinister, this is Super Triforce Bros, and thanks for watching. But don't go just yet, because for your viewing pleasure, here's my boss fight with the Dark Liquor. He's an optional boss. He's incredibly difficult. It took me over 15 attempts just to get this footage. I just thought it would look really cool at the end of my video, so I did it for bragging rights. So, you're welcome, and please enjoy.